Stop, you're about to make the biggest mistake of your life. The words cut through the still air before anyone even realized what was happening, before the movement could finish, before the moment could become something irreversible, and suddenly the entire marble driveway fell silent as if the world itself had paused to listen. Richard Cole's hand hovered midair, not touching, not moving, just suspended between impulse and consequence, his tailored sleeve catching the late afternoon light. The sharp lines of his suit clashing against the fragile figure. In front of him, a woman wrapped in worn layers that didn't belong in a place like this, her shoes scuffed, her breath uneven, her presence an interruption in a world built on precision and control, and right there between them stood Amara Johnson, her hand gripping his wrist, not forcefully, not aggressively, but firmly enough to stop time, her pulse racing under her skin, her fingers trembling just slightly, yet her eyes steady, locked onto his with a clarity that didn't match her position in this house, because she was just the maid, the one who moved quietly through hallways, the one who polished surfaces until they reflected perfection, the one no one really saw until something went wrong, and yet here she was, stepping into a line no one in her position ever crossed, the air thick, security frozen a few feet away, unsure whether to intervene or wait for a command that hadn't come yet. Richard's jaw tightening as confusion flickered behind his controlled expression, not anger yet. Not fully, just the first crack in certainty. "Let go," he said, his voice low, measured, the kind of voice that usually ended conversations instantly. But Amara didn't move, not this time, her breath catching as she looked past the power, past the authority, straight into something deeper, something buried. "You don't understand," she said, her voice softer now but somehow heavier, like it carried more than just words. The woman on the ground shifted slightly, a faint sound escaping her lips. Something fragile, something almost forgotten, and then it came, barely above a whisper. "Richard!" The name lingered in the air like a ghost that refused to leave, and for the briefest second, something changed, something invisible but undeniable. Richard's fingers loosened just enough for Amara to feel it, not surrender, not yet, but hesitation, real hesitation, and she knew. She had seconds, maybe less. "June 14th. She said, each word precise, deliberate. "The fire, St. Mary's Hospital, room 214, you were 8 years old." The driveway seemed to shrink around them, the world narrowing to just those details, too specific, too exact, the kind of details no outsider should know, and now his eyes shifted, not at her, but somewhere inward, somewhere memory lived, and the silence that followed wasn't empty anymore, it was heavy, charged, waiting for something to break. And as the woman slowly lifted her head, her eyes meeting his with something that didn't belong to strangers, something older, something deeper, the truth stood there between them, not spoken fully, not confirmed, but impossible to ignore, and for the first time, Richard Cole took a step back, not from fear, but from something far more unsettling. Recognition beginning to take shape where certainty once stood. Richard did not speak right away, and that silence stretched longer than anyone in that driveway was used to, because men like him filled silence with commands, with decisions, with control. But now he simply stood there, eyes fixed on the woman in front of him as if trying to place a face that refused to stay in the present, his mind reaching backward without permission, searching through years he had carefully sealed off. And Amara felt the shift before anyone else did. She felt it in the slight loosening of his posture, in the way his shoulders no longer carried the same rigid certainty. The staff behind them remained still, pretending not to watch but unable to look away, because something was happening that did not belong to routine, did not belong to hierarchy, and certainly did not belong to someone like her stepping into the center of it. "This is not possible," Richard finally said, but the words lacked the force they should have carried, as if he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. The woman on the ground let out a fragile breath, her hands trembling as she pressed them against the stone surface for balance, her eyes never leaving his face, searching, hoping, fearing all at once. "You used to hate the dark," she whispered, her voice uneven but certain. "You would count the seconds between the hallway light and your bedroom door, 5 steps, always 5. The detail landed softly but deeply, too intimate to dismiss, too precise to ignore, and something in Richard's expression flickered again, A memory brushing against the surface, uninvited, unwelcome, yet impossible to stop. Amara tightened her hold just slightly, not to restrain him, but to keep him anchored in the moment. "You were not supposed to remember that," he said quietly, almost to himself, and that was the first crack, the first admission that something about this moment had reached past his defenses. The air felt different. Now heavier, like a storm gathering without warning. "Sir?" One of the security guards spoke cautiously from behind. "Do you want us to remove her?" But Richard did not answer, not immediately, because now he was looking at the woman differently, not as an interruption, not as a problem to be solved, but as something unresolved, something unfinished, and Amara saw it clearly. This was the turning point, the moment where truth either broke through or disappeared forever. "There was a necklace," Amara said, her voice steady despite the weight pressing on her chest. "A small gold heart with 2 letters engraved on it." Richard's head turned sharply toward her, faster than before, sharper than before, and this time the reaction was undeniable. "Where did you hear that?" he asked, his tone lower now, no longer commanding but searching, and Amara swallowed, choosing her next words carefully because she knew this was the line that could not be crossed without consequence. "Because she never took it off," she said, glancing down at the woman, whose shaking hands slowly reached beneath the worn fabric at her collar, and when she pulled it free, the chain caught the fading sunlight, revealing the small gold heart, worn but unmistakable, and for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, because the truth was no longer something abstract, it was visible, tangible, undeniable. And Richard stared at it as if it had just rewritten everything he believed about his past. His breathing slowed, then faltered, and for the first time since this moment began, he did not look like the man who owned everything around him. He looked like someone standing at the edge of a memory he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. The necklace did not shine like something expensive. It shined like something that had survived, its surface worn down by time rather than neglect, and Richard could not look away from it, his eyes tracing the tiny engraved letters as if they might rearrange themselves into something easier to accept, but they did not. They stayed exactly as they were, steady, unchanging, and suddenly the air around him felt thinner, like each breath had to work harder to reach his lungs. "That is not, it cannot be," he said, but his voice no longer carried authority, it carried distance, like it was coming from somewhere far behind him. The woman's hands trembled as she held the necklace up, not presenting it as proof, not demanding recognition, just offering it the way someone offers a memory they are afraid might be rejected. "You used to play with this when you could not sleep," she said softly. "You would hold it and say it felt warm, like it remembered things for you." And that was when something deeper shifted, not just recognition, but emotion, something raw and unguarded pressing against the walls he had built for years. Amara saw it in the way his fingers twitched slightly at his side, in the way his gaze flickered between the necklace and the woman's face, searching for alignment, for logic, for anything that would let him place this moment into something rational. But there was no clean explanation waiting for him, only fragments of a past he had buried. "She died," Richard said suddenly, more firmly now, as if saying it out loud might restore order. "I was told she died that night." And the certainty in that statement lingered, but it no longer felt complete. The woman shook her head slowly, her expression carrying something heavier than denial, something closer to endurance. "They told you that," she replied, her voice fragile but unwavering. "But I was still there, Richard, I was still breathing." The words did not rise, they settled, heavy and quiet, and the driveway seemed to hold them in place, the staff behind them now completely still, no one pretending anymore, because this was no longer a situation to manage, it was something unfolding that none of them understood. Amara's grip on his wrist loosened just slightly, not because she was stepping back, but because she could feel he was no longer trying to move forward. He was standing still on his own now, caught between what he had always believed and what was unfolding in front of him. "If that is true," he said slowly, each word measured, "then where have you been?" And it was not an accusation, not entirely, it was a question shaped by years of absence, years of silence that now demanded an answer. The woman lowered the necklace slightly, her shoulders rising and falling with a breath that seemed to carry more weight than it should. "I stayed where they left me," she said. "And when I came back, there was no place for me in your world anymore." The simplicity of her words carried something deeper than explanation, something that filled the gaps without needing to list them, and Richard's expression shifted again, not fully understanding, not fully accepting, but no longer rejecting, and for the first time since this moment began, his gaze dropped, not to the ground, but to the space between them, as if he was finally seeing the distance that had always been there. The distance that no amount of power or control could erase, and Amara stood there quietly, her presence no longer just an interruption, but the bridge between two realities that had finally collided, and the truth, once distant and uncertain, now stood firmly in place, waiting for him to decide what to do with it. Richard did not answer her right away, and that silence felt heavier than anything that had been said. It pressed into the space between them, into the polished stone beneath their feet, into the watching eyes of everyone who no longer pretended this was just another moment that would pass, because it was not passing, it was unfolding, and for the first time in years, maybe decades, Richard Coles stood without a script, without control, without the certainty that had built his entire world. His gaze remained lowered for a second longer before slowly lifting again, not sharp, not commanding, but searching, and when his eyes met hers this time, there was something different there, not acceptance yet, but something closer to recognition trying to take shape. "If you were alive," he said, his voice quieter now, measured in a way that suggested he was choosing each word carefully. "Then why did no one come forward? Why was there nothing, no record, no claim?" The question hung in the air not as an accusation, but as a need for structure, for something that could make sense of the years that now felt unstable. The woman's hands tightened slightly around the necklace before she let it fall gently back against her chest, her shoulders rising with a breath that carried fatigue, the kind that does not come from a single moment but from a long stretch of being unseen. "Because I did not have anything left to prove who I was," she said, her voice steady but soft. "And the people who could have spoken for me chose not to." Richard's brow tightened, not in anger, but in concentration, like he was trying to align pieces that refused to fit, and Amara watched closely. She could feel the shift deepening. This was no longer resistance, it was confrontation with something internal, something he could not dismiss with authority or distance. "You are saying someone made that decision for me?" he said, more to himself than to her, and the weight of that realization settled slowly, like a door opening to something he had never questioned before. The woman nodded once, not dramatically, not with emphasis, just a quiet confirmation that did not need to be explained in detail, because the absence of years already spoke loudly enough. The breeze moved lightly through the driveway, carrying the faint scent of rain from somewhere far off, and for a moment, the environment itself seemed to pause again, as if giving space for something fragile to form. Richard took a step back, not in retreat, but in recalibration, his eyes moving briefly toward the house behind him, the structure that had defined his life, his control, his identity, and for the first time, it looked different, not smaller, but less certain, as if it no longer held all the answers he once believed it did. "I built everything on what I was told," he said quietly, almost under his breath, and there was no response to that, no immediate correction, because it was not something that could be argued, it was something that had to be realized. Amara finally released his wrist completely, her hand lowering slowly to her side, her role shifting again, not stepping away, but no longer needing to hold him in place, because now he was standing there on his own, facing something that could not be undone, and the woman watched him, not moving closer, not reaching out, just waiting, her presence steady despite everything that had brought her here, and in that moment, the distance between them felt both enormous and incredibly small, like it could close with a single step, or remain open for a lifetime, and Richard's eyes returned to her once more, no longer sharp, no longer guarded, but carrying a question that had not yet found its voice, the kind of question that changes everything once it is asked, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of possibility, fragile, uncertain, and impossible to ignore. The question never fully left his lips, but it lived in his eyes now, and that alone was enough to shift everything again, because Richard Cole was a man who built empires on answers, not questions, and yet here he stood, searching, uncertain, and that uncertainty rippled outward, reaching even the staff who had spent years watching him move through life with unshakable control. Amara felt it too. The way the tension in the air no longer pointed outward but inward, turning back on him, forcing him to confront something far more difficult than any external conflict, and for a moment, no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because whatever came next would not be small, it would not be simple, it would redefine everything that stood here. Say it, the woman whispered gently, not pushing, not demanding, just inviting the truth to surface, and Richard inhaled slowly, the breath deeper than before, as if he needed it to steady something inside him that had begun to shift. Why now? He asked, finally giving shape to the question that had been forming. After all these years, why come back here? His voice did not carry accusation, but it carried weight, the weight of absence, of years that could not be undone, and the woman's eyes softened, not with pity, but with something closer to understanding. Because I heard your name again, she said. Not as a child's name, but as a man's name, a name that built something powerful, something visible, and I realized you had grown into a life that did not know where it came from. Her words settled slowly, like pieces finding their place, and Richard's gaze dropped again, not in avoidance, but in reflection, the kind that does not happen quickly, the kind that unfolds layer by layer. You think I forgot, he said quietly, but I did not forget. I was told to move forward, to focus on what was in front of me. And there was something in that statement, something that revealed more than it intended. Amara caught it immediately, the language of someone who had been guided, shaped, directed, not just by circumstance, but by influence, and now that influence stood exposed, not in detail, but in absence, in the gaps where truths should have been. The woman nodded slowly. And you did what you had to do to survive, she said. Her voice steady, not blaming, not accusing, just acknowledging, and that acknowledgement landed differently than anything else had so far. It did not challenge him, it did not oppose him, it met him where he stood, and for the first time, Richard's posture shifted again, his shoulders lowering slightly, the tension easing not because the situation was resolved, but because something inside him had begun to accept that this moment was real, that it could not be dismissed or undone. There were nights, she continued, her voice softer now, when I thought about coming back sooner, but I did not know if there was still a place for me in your life. The honesty in that sentence filled the space between them more than any explanation could, and Richard looked at her again, really looked this time, not searching for proof, not analyzing, just seeing, and what he saw was not just a woman from his past, but someone who had carried a connection to him through years he had lived without her. And that realization did not come with clarity, it came with weight, the kind that settles slowly but changes everything it touches. Amara stepped back half a step, giving the moment room to breathe, her role now quieter, but no less important, because she had brought them to this point, and now what happened next belonged to them. And as the light shifted slightly across the driveway, casting longer shadows that stretched toward the house, Richard stood there, no longer the man who controlled everything around him, but someone standing at the edge of a truth that demanded more than control. It demanded recognition, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was waiting for him to decide whether he would step forward or turn away. Once again the wind moved softly through the long driveway, brushing against the edges of stillness like something careful not to disturb what had already begun to change, and for a moment no one spoke, not Richard, not the woman, not even the staff who now stood at a distance, as if instinctively understanding that this space no longer belonged to them, it belonged to something quieter, something deeper, something that could not be rushed. Richard's gaze lingered on the necklace again, then slowly lifted, not with the sharp precision he was known for, but with a weight that seemed to pull upward rather than push forward. I spent years believing I had already lost everything that night, he said, his voice lower than before, almost blending into the air instead of cutting through it. And I learned how to build something new without looking back. The admission did not sound like pride, it sounded like survival, like a truth he had repeated so many times it had become part of him. The woman listened without interrupting, her posture still. Her presence steady, not stepping closer, not stepping away, just holding her ground in a way that did not challenge him but did not disappear either. "But if what you are saying is true," he continued, pausing briefly as if the words themselves required effort, "then everything I built started from something incomplete." The sentence lingered, not as a conclusion, but as a realization still forming, and Amara felt it fully now, the shift from resistance to reflection, from control to awareness. She did not speak, she did not move, she simply remained there, her role now quiet but essential, like a witness to something that could not be undone. The woman's eyes softened slightly, not with relief, not yet, but with something closer to patience, the kind that comes from waiting longer than expected. "You were not incomplete," she said gently. "You were just missing a part of your story." And the distinction settled differently than anything else had. It did not diminish him, it did not challenge his achievements, it simply reframed them, and for a moment Richard stood very still, as if adjusting to that idea. The house behind him stood tall, its glass reflecting the fading light, its structure still strong, still untouched, but something about it felt less certain now, as if it no longer held the same absolute authority it once did. A faint rumble of distant thunder rolled across the sky, subtle but present, and with it came the first drop of rain, light, almost hesitant, landing on the stone between them, then another, and another, until a soft pattern began to form, not heavy, not overwhelming, just enough to be noticed, the kind of rain that changes the air more than the ground, and Richard looked down briefly, watching the droplets scatter across the surface. Then back up again, his expression no longer guarded in the same way. No longer closed, but not fully open either, suspended somewhere in between. "I do not know what comes next," he said honestly, the words simple but significant, because they carried something he rarely allowed, uncertainty, and the woman nodded, not as agreement, but as understanding. "You do not have to know right now," she replied, her voice calm. "You just have to decide if you are willing to find out." And that was where the moment settled, not in resolution, not in closure, but in possibility, the rain continuing its quiet rhythm, the space between them no longer filled with tension, but with something softer, something fragile, something waiting, and Amara stood there silently. Her presence no longer needed to hold anything in place, because what had begun could now stand on its own, and as the light dimmed slightly and the world around them seemed to fade just enough to focus on what mattered, Richard remained where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping away, but no longer standing against the truth, and that alone was enough to change everything. The rain continued to fall in a soft, steady rhythm, each drop tracing faint lines across the marble as if time itself had slowed just enough to let everything settle into place, and Richard stood there, unmoving, his eyes no longer scanning for answers but holding on to something that had finally surfaced, something he could no longer push away. His voice when it came was quieter than anyone had ever heard it. Not weakened, but stripped of the layers that once defined it. "If I accept this," he said slowly, each word deliberate, "then I have to accept that I have been living beside the truth without ever seeing it." The admission did not echo, it sank, deep and irreversible, and the woman did not rush to respond, she simply watched him, her expression carrying neither triumph nor relief, only a calm patience that had been shaped by years of waiting. "Truth does not disappear just because it is ignored," she said gently. "It waits until you are ready to see it." And that was when something shifted fully, not partially, not uncertainly, but clearly. Richard's posture changed, not in a dramatic motion, but in a subtle release, like something heavy had finally been set down. His shoulders lowered, his gaze softened, and for the first time since this moment began, he stepped forward, not quickly, not impulsively, but with intention, closing a distance that had existed far longer than the space between them. The staff behind him remained still, witnessing something they had never seen before. A man who commanded everything now choosing to approach something he could not control. Amara watched quietly, her role now complete in a way that did not require acknowledgement. Because what she had done was not about recognition, it was about truth, and that truth now moved on its own. Richard stopped just a few feet away from the woman, close enough to see the details he had missed before, the fine lines shaped by time, the quiet strength in her expression, the familiarity that no longer felt distant but deeply rooted, and his voice, when it returned, carried something entirely different, not authority, not distance, but vulnerability. "I do not remember everything," he admitted, "but I remember enough to know that this is not a coincidence." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that shifted the entire moment, because they were no longer resisting, they were acknowledging, and the woman's eyes glistened slightly, not with tears that fell, but with something held carefully in place, something too meaningful to release too quickly. "That is all I needed you to say," she replied softly, and the space between them changed again, no longer defined by uncertainty, but by connection beginning to take form. The rain softened, its rhythm slowing, as if the world itself had exhaled, and Richard hesitated for just a second, not out of doubt, but out of understanding the significance of what came next. Then slowly, carefully, he extended his hand, not as a gesture of control, not as a command, but as an offering, something simple, something human, and the woman looked at it for a moment before lifting her own, placing it in his with a gentleness that carried years of absence and presence at the same time, and in that quiet contact, something settled, not fully resolved, not fully complete, but undeniably real, and Amara, standing just a step behind, felt it clearly, the moment where power no longer defined the space, where truth had taken its place, and where a man who once stood above everything had finally chosen to stand within something that mattered far more. The moment their hands touched did not feel like resolution, it felt like the beginning of something fragile, something that could still break if handled too quickly, and Richard felt it immediately, the warmth, the unfamiliar steadiness, the quiet reality of contact that could not be explained away. His fingers did not tighten, they remained careful, almost uncertain, as if he understood that this was not something he could take, only something he could accept. And the woman's hand rested in his without resistance, not gripping, not pulling, just present, the kind of presence that does not demand recognition but exists whether it is acknowledged or not. And for a few seconds neither of them spoke, because there were no words that could fully carry what had just shifted. The rain softened further, barely audible now, the air cooling around them as the light dimmed into a muted gray, and somewhere behind them, the house stood unchanged. Yet everything about it felt different, as if its walls no longer defined the space but simply surrounded it. Richard's gaze lowered briefly to their hands, then lifted again to her face, and this time there was no search in his eyes, no calculation, just a quiet acceptance forming, incomplete but real. "I should have asked more questions," he said, his voice steady but softer than before. "I should have looked beyond what I was told." And it was not an apology shaped for forgiveness, it was an acknowledgement shaped by understanding, and the woman listened without interrupting, her expression calm, not seeking validation, not measuring his words, simply receiving them. "You were a child," she replied gently. "You trusted the world around you to tell you the truth." And that response did not remove the weight of his realization, but it shifted it, it placed it in a space where it could be understood rather than resisted. Richard exhaled slowly, the breath longer than before, as if something inside him had finally found room to move, and then he did something no one there had ever seen him do. He lowered his gaze fully, not in defeat, not in weakness, but in humility, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that simply exists when the truth becomes undeniable. "I cannot change what happened," he said quietly, "but I can decide what happens now." And that sentence settled into the space like a turning point, not dramatic, not loud, but clear, and the woman's eyes softened slightly, not with relief, but with something deeper, something that recognized the weight of that choice. "That is all anyone can do," she said, and for a moment, that was enough, not to erase the past, not to fill the years that had been lost, but to create a path forward that had not existed before. Amara stood just behind them, her presence now almost invisible again, but her eyes steady, taking in the moment not with surprise, but with quiet understanding. Because she had seen the shift before anyone else, she had felt it in the moment she chose to step forward, and now she watched as it unfolded into something real, something lasting. Richard released her hand slowly, not pulling away, just letting the moment settle into itself, and as he stepped slightly to the side, creating space rather than distance, his gaze turned briefly toward Amara. And in that look there was something unspoken, something that did not need words. Recognition not of her position, but of her action, of the truth she had carried into this space when no one else would, and though he said nothing, the shift in his expression was enough, because for the first time, he saw her not as someone who served within his world, but as someone who had changed it, and as the last of the rain faded into a quiet stillness, the three of them stood there. No longer separated by roles or assumptions, but connected by a truth that had finally been allowed to exist. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving only the faint scent of wet stone in the air, and with it came a silence that no longer felt heavy, but full, like something had finally found its place after being lost for too long. Richard stood still for a moment, his gaze drifting from the woman to the ground and then back again, as if anchoring himself in a reality that had only just begun to feel real. The world around him had not changed, the house was still there, the staff still watching from a distance, the structure of his life still intact, and yet something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone, and for the first time, that did not feel like a loss. It felt like clarity. He took a slow breath, deeper than before, and then stepped forward again, this time not hesitating, not calculating, just moving with intention, closing the remaining distance until there was no space left between what he had believed and what now stood in front of him. "You said you stayed where they left you," he said quietly, his voice steady but changed. "Then you came back on your own." And she nodded once, her expression calm, her posture unchanged. "I did not come back for anything that was yours," she replied. "I came back because something that was mine was still here." And the words settled gently, not demanding, not accusing, just stating a truth that needed no defense. Richard's eyes softened further, the last trace of resistance fading, replaced by something quieter, something grounded, and he gave a small nod, not to agree, but to acknowledge, to accept, and then, without ceremony, without announcement, he turned slightly toward the house and spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough for those watching to hear. "Prepare a room," he said, his tone calm, not commanding but certain, "and make sure everything she needs is taken care of." The staff did not hesitate this time, not because they were ordered, but because they understood something had changed, and as they moved, the space around them shifted again, no longer defined by hierarchy, but by something more human, more real. The woman did not react immediately, she did not step forward or express relief, she simply watched him, her eyes searching. Not for proof, but for consistency, for the quiet follow-through that matters more than words, and Richard met that gaze without looking away, because now he understood that this was not about a single moment, it was about what came after. Amara stood behind them, her presence returning to its quiet place, but not unnoticed, not anymore, and as Richard turned slightly toward her once more, his eyes held a different kind of recognition, one that did not need to be spoken aloud, one that acknowledged the role she had played in bringing truth into a space that had never made room for it before, and though he said nothing, the silence between them carried understanding, the kind that does not fade once it is seen, and as the last light of the day softened across the driveway, casting long reflections across the wet stone, the three of them stood there in a moment that did not need words to complete it, because everything that mattered had already been set in motion, and in that quiet stillness, where power had given way to truth, and distance had given way to recognition, the only thing left was the sound of breath, steady, real, and shared between people who had finally chosen to see each other clearly.